One cannot not communicate. You've probably heard that one before. It is one of 5 axioms of communication by psychologists Paul Watzlawick, Janet Beavin, Bavelas and Don D. Jackson. And today we'll find out what they are about. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today we will discuss the 5 axioms of communication. This begs the question, what the hell is an axiom? An axiom is, simply put, a basic assumption. So what we have here are 5 basic assumptions about how communication works. Those 5 axioms are quite popular and well known, and they have been quite influential as well. They have, among others, greatly influenced Schulz von Thun's work, as we will see in a moment. Watzlawick, Beavin and Jackson, in turn, have been greatly influenced by Gregory Bateson. We've heard that name before. It appeared in our video about metacommunication because Bateson was the one who coined the term metacommunication. So let's have a look at those axioms. The very first one, as I said before, is one cannot not communicate. Now this is a pretty strong statement, but is it true? Let's say I'm sitting at my desk at work and a colleague enters the room. What can I do? Usually I would greet him, hello, but this would obviously be a communication, so it's out of the question. Instead, I could try just continuing doing what I was doing before, not looking up, not saying anything, completely ignoring his presence. Now, what effect would this have on my colleague? He would probably wonder, what's up with that guy? Is he angry at me or anything? He must have noticed I've entered the room. I'm standing right in front of him. Why doesn't he say anything? Why doesn't he acknowledge my presence? Is something wrong with him? Is he angry, in a bad mood? So me ignoring him would still be a strong message to him that is in no way that has in no way less impact than that hello. So this would still be communication. Let's look at another example. Let's say I'm sitting in my living room reading a book and my girlfriend enters the room. She goes to the computer and looks something up on the internet. And when she enters, I completely ignore her. I just continue reading my book. I don't do or say anything. And she as well doesn't acknowledge my presence in any way. She just proceeds to the computer and does something. And this wouldn't be unusual. I mean, if you live together, you don't greet each other each time you run into each other. So wouldn't this be a situation where there is no communication at all? Well, imagine the one entering would not be my girlfriend, but a complete stranger. I would say, oh, who are you and what are you doing in my living room? So the fact that I don't react to my girlfriend entering the room is a message in itself, a message of intimacy. Like, it is perfectly normal for me that you are here, that you enter the room, and it doesn't disturb me. I can just continue reading. It doesn't bother me in any way. So even there, we still have a strong message and we still have a communication. So wherever 2 or more people come together, communication will inevitably take place. The second axiom is every communication has a content and a relationship aspect, such that the latter classifies the former and is therefore a metacommunication. Now this sounds complicated, but we'll go through it step by step. At first it says communication has a content and a relationship aspect. Now this sounds similar for for us. So let's say a man says to a woman, "You have beautiful eyes." Now this is cliché, of course, but it works well as an example here. Now the content aspect, the facts that are included in this statement, "Your eyes are beautiful," is pretty meaningless here. The woman won't react by saying, "Oh, thank you for the information, good that I know." But the important thing is the relationship aspect that is included in this statement, that the man finds her beautiful and finds her attractive and wants to say something nice, and that he is attracted to her, and he's making her a compliment. And we know this from Schulz von Thun's works. Schulz von Thun's 4 sides of a message is based on the same idea, that communication contains different aspects, different facets that can be distinguished. And Schulz von Thun didn't just have the content or factual information and the relationship aspect, but he also had the self-revelation that here is considered part of the relationship aspect, and he also had the appeal that is not further discussed here. Alright, next we have the latter classifies the former. So the relationship aspect explains how the content aspect is to be understood. In our example, as I said, the factual information, the content, you have beautiful eyes, is pretty meaningless, but the relationship aspect gives the explanation. This is not meant as factual information, this is meant as a compliment. And this is also what is meant by it is therefore a metacommunication, since the relationship aspect explains how this content aspect, this content part of the communication is to be understood. It is communication about communication, and that's what metacommunication is. We have discussed that in more detail in a separate video already. The third axiom is the nature of a relationship is contingent upon the punctuation of the communicational sequence between the communicants. Now this sounds really complicated, but it actually describes quite a simple phenomenon. Imagine a married couple, and between them the following cycle permanently takes place. The wife criticizes the husband therefore withdraws from the wife, therefore the wife criticizes him, therefore the husband withdraws, and so on. An endless cycle without beginning or end, an endless sequence of criticism and withdrawal. Now the important thing is, if we would ask the husband, what's going on in your relationship, he would probably describe it like this: my wife criticizes me, therefore I withdraw, period. And if you asked the wife, she would probably say, what goes on is, my husband withdraws, therefore I criticize him, period. This goes on again and again. So they both separate this endless sequence into fragments according to their understanding, and their understanding is that their own behavior is merely a reaction to the partner's behavior, and the partner's behavior is the trigger, the stimulus. And the fact that their own behavior is in turn trigger and stimulus for the partner's behavior again, this they do not understand. And this again is something that should sound very familiar to us, because Schulz von Thun's vicious circles and his communication styles are based on the same ideas. Let's have a look at the fourth axiom. Human beings communicate both digitally and analogically. There follows a rather complicated explanation, but I will put it in simpler words. What Watzlawick, Beavin and Jackson refer to as digital here is our spoken language, the actual words. Using spoken language, we can give very specific and distinct explanation. We can explain abstract ideas. We can explain facts. We can explain logical relationships. But language is not very well suited for explaining relationships and for establishing relationships. If you try to exactly explain how you feel at the moment in words, you will notice that this is rather difficult, so their language has a weak spot. On the other hand, we have analogical communication, and this is paraverbal and nonverbal communication. Paraverbal means our manner of speaking, such as volume, rhythm, intonation, things like that. And nonverbal means our gestures and our facial expressions. And this analogical communication, manner of speaking, facial expressions and gestures, they are well suited for describing and establishing relationships, such as showing a tender gesture, a loving gesture, things like that, but it is not well suited for explaining facts or logical relationships. So when we communicate, we use a combination of both. And an important point here is that digital communication, spoken language, is primarily used for the content aspect of communication, while analogical communication, manner of speaking, facial expressions, gestures, is primarily used for the relationship aspect. And here, the second axiom we discussed before becomes much clearer. The second axiom stated that the relationship aspect classifies the content aspect. So what this basically means is our manner of speaking, our gestures and our facial expressions explain how our words are supposed to be understood. For example, imagine a father who says to his children, "Tidy up your room." If he says this laughing and in a friendly tone and with a friendly facial expression, then this is probably just a friendly suggestion. However, if his face is all red and he is screaming and angry, then this is probably a rather strong command. Let's look at the fifth and final axiom. All communicational interchanges are either symmetrical or complementary, depending on whether they are based on equality or difference. Now, symmetrical and complementary, those terms we have encountered before in Schulz von Thun's works. Complementary means in an interaction both parties take on different roles. Which often means that one takes a higher position and the other takes a lower position, and those different positions complement each other. This is, for example, what we have in the relationship between parents and children, or between teachers and students, or between superiors and employees. So this is based on difference. Then we have symmetrical relationships that are based on equality, where both parties interact on the same level, they take on the same role. This we have, for example, between colleagues of the same rank, or between siblings of the same age, or between spouses in a married couple. So, in the examples I just gave, the type of relationship, whether it's complementary or symmetrical, is defined due to external factors. For example, if you are a child and you have parents, you are in a parent-child relationship, and this will always be complementary. However, for most of our relationship, the type of relationship is negotiated over time. Imagine, for example, a group of kids or a group of teenagers, and Susan is the leader of the group. Now, how did Susan become the leader of the group? Did she at one point say, you folks, you all do as I say, I'm the boss now? No, probably not, because the others wouldn't have agreed to that. What has happened is probably that again and again, Susan's suggestions and ideas and opinions were favorably reacted to by the other members of the group. They often said, oh, well, what Susan says makes sense, or Susan's suggestions are nice, I agree to them. And over time, this developed into her leadership role. One thing that is very important to note here is that complementary relationships are not by definition good, and symmetrical or bad and symmetrical are not always good. It always depends on the specific relationship. You can have functional or dysfunctional, good or bad complementary relationships, and the same is true for symmetrical relationships. Now, for example, you can imagine if you think of the relationship between superior and employees, you can have a boss who is a real monster and treats his people really bad, and this is horrible. But you can also have a boss who is really great and helpful, and who everyone is happy and glad to have. And the same is true for symmetrical relationships. A symmetrical relationship can be two people just respecting each other and not bothering each other. It can be two people who compete in a sportsmanlike way, or two people who fight each other in the most sinister ways. For symmetrical relationships, it is often, symmetrical relationships often have this aspect of competition, where both parties try to get to the upper hand. So this often occurs in symmetrical relationships. And finally, an aspect that is very important to understand here is that one needs to distinguish between a relationship, a longer lasting relationship, and a single interaction that takes place in a single moment. Imagine, for example, a mother playing a board game with her daughter. In this moment, a perfectly symmetrical interaction takes place, because they both play according to the same rules. They are on the same level while playing the game. However, they are, of course, still in a complementary relationship, which gives the mother the option at any time to say, oh, it has gotten late, you better go brush your teeth and then you go to bed. And the daughter, of course, does not have this option. So it's important to distinguish between the relationship and a single interaction, because they can be different. So, bottom line, the 5 axioms by Watzlawick, Beavin, and Jackson provide pretty much what they promise. They provide a basic understanding of how communication works. It is certainly not exhaustive, but it is a great starting point and a great basis. The axioms are still popular and well known today, they are still relevant today, and they have been an inspiration and an influence for later works, especially those by Schulz von Thun. Now, in the end, I would like to say a few words about this book, Pragmatics of Human Communication, because this is the book the 5 axioms are described in. This is where they come from. Now, you probably wonder what pragmatics are in this context. I had to look it up myself. Pragmatics here is a term from linguistics. Basically, pragmatics is the body of syntax and semantics, and it is about context sensitive meaning. So if you ask, do you have a watch? Semantics would answer yes, and pragmatics would answer it is 2:30. What we learn from this is that this is not some easy reading. This is a rather complicated book. Then we see that it has 3 authors, the people I mentioned frequently before: Paul Watzlawick, Janet Beavin Bavelas, and Don D. Jackson. Nowadays, the 5 axioms of communication are usually attributed to Watzlawick alone. However, they were created by those 3. Of course, I can't tell if maybe Watzlawick contributed more to the book than the others, but it's not possible to tell from the book, because in the book there is no distinction which parts have been written by whom, so I would attribute the axioms to all 3 of them. The book was released in 1967, and the context is interesting. It starts with Don D. Jackson. Jackson was very important in regard to family therapy. He laid important foundations there and was very famous in that area. And Jackson worked with Gregory Bateson, you know, the guy that inspired them all and they all looked up to. And the book is also there is a small remark in the beginning to Gregory Bateson, friend and mentor. And after working with Bateson, Jackson founded the Mental Research Institute, MRI for short, in Palo Alto. And there in the MRI, a lot of important psychological researchers of the time gathered. Among those were Paul Watzlawick and Janet Beavin Bavelas, and there was also, for example, Virginia Satir, which we will probably discuss at a later time in this channel. And those famous psychologists worked together and did research together. And one aspect that is very important is that they didn't focus so much on the individual patient, but on the interactions with his surroundings. So they didn't say, oh, well, this person has a mental disorder. If we examine him closely, we will figure out what it is and how it works. But they said, let's have a look at how he is, he interacts with the people in his surroundings and how they interact with them, with him, how his relationships work and how the communication works. And this will give us important clues. And at the time, this was quite a novel and unusual approach, so this was something special. I mentioned Virginia Satir. She is very important in regard to systematic therapy, and this follows a similar approach where you don't look at the patient alone, but you look at the patient's surroundings and his interactions and his relationships. The work at the MRI produced 2 books. Now, obviously, all of those psychologists, they published books and articles by themselves, but 2 books emerged out of the contribution between different people. And the first of those is this one, The Pragmatics of Human Communication by Watzlawick, Beavin and Jackson. And the other is called Change by Watzlawick, John Weakland and Richard Fish. Maybe we will have a look at that one later in this channel. One book we will certainly have a look at in the near future is Watzlawick's book, The Situation is Hopeless but Not Serious. I hope you will communicate with me in the comments. I'm looking forward to your feedback. And if you enjoyed the video, you can express this using a like. I would greatly appreciate if you continue interacting with the channel, because we have plenty more videos about exciting soft skill topics and new ones are added each week, such as next week where we discuss the Rubicon model. For today I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.